There's a rock in the North Atlantic that men learned to fear long before anyone ever thought to build on it. It sits about 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis, out past the edge of the maps that most people bother to look at. One of 7 scraps of stone the old Gaelic fishermen called the Seven Hunters. The largest of them is named Eilean Mòr, the Big Island. 7 Hunters was the name the old people used for the whole group, and nobody's entirely sure why. Some say the 7 islets looked like hunters wading out into the water. Some say it's older than any reason we still have. Either way, it was never a friendly name, and it was never a friendly place, though there is nothing big about Eilean Mòr. 1/3 of a mile of grass and gull droppings on top of a cliff 200 feet high, with the whole Atlantic leaning against it, year in, year out, the way a heavy man leans against a door he means to break. And on the 15th of December in the year 1900, 3 men who lived on that rock walked out of a warm lighthouse and were never seen again. Not their bodies, not their boat, because they had no boat. Not a single mark on the sea to say where they'd gone, just a door and a stopped clock and a meal nobody finished. Before I take you out to that rock, I want to know where you're hearing this from tonight. Drop it in the comments. A city, a country, the room you're sitting in with the lights off. I go through every one of them, and it means something to me to know how far this story travels. And while you're settling in, if you like being somewhere lonely and old and just a little bit wrong, I put together something called What the Mountain Keeps. 8 hours of folk horror. No ads, no breaks. Just a voice and a landscape and the sort of dread that builds slowly. The link is in the description and pinned to the top of the comments. Put it on tonight after this and let it take its time with you. Now, let me tell you about the rock first, because the rock matters. The rock has a reputation older than the lighthouse. Long before anyone built anything on Eilean Mòr, the men of Lewis knew the Flannan Isles as a place you visited carefully, if you visited at all. There was a ruined chapel up there, a low stone cell of a thing, said to have been built by a hermit called St. Flannan somewhere back in the 7th century. Shepherds used to bring sheep across in the summer to graze the good grass, and the sheep did well on it, which tells you the island wasn't cursed in any ordinary sense. But the men who brought the sheep had rules. You did not stay overnight if you could help it. When you came up over the lip of the cliff, you were meant to take your hat off, turn a full circle sunwise, and give thanks that the sea had let you land. You did not point at anything. You did not name certain things out loud. And you never, ever took anything off the island back home with you. Not a stone, not a stick, not a feather, because whatever you carried off Eilean Mòr, the island would want back. Now, you can call all of that superstition. Islanders being islanders. But hold on to it, because there's a particular kind of dread in an empty place that people have been warning each other about for 1,000 years. And then one day, the warning stops being a story. For most of history, nobody needed to think about the Flannans very hard. Then the shipping lanes got busier. By the end of the 1800s, the sea road out around the north of Scotland was thick with traffic. Steamers running the Atlantic, cargo boats cutting past the Hebrides in the dark, and that unlit rock sitting right in the middle of it like a held breath. Too many ships were coming to grief out there. So the Northern Lighthouse Board decided to do the almost impossible thing. They decided to put a light on Eilean Mòr. The man they gave it to was David Allen Stevenson. If you know the name Stevenson and Scotland, you might be thinking of Robert Louis, who wrote Treasure Island. This was his cousin. The family didn't write adventures. The family built lighthouses, generation after generation, on the worst rocks, in the worst water in the whole of the British Isles. Building on Eilean Mòr took them 4 years, from 1895 to 1899. Everything had to come up that cliff. Every stone, every barrel of cement, every iron rail, hauled off a pitching boat onto a slick ledge and dragged up the face of the rock on a little railway they had to build first, just to build the rest. They cut landing places on 2 sides, an east landing and a west landing, so that whichever way the sea was running, there'd be one side calm enough to come ashore. They laid tramway tracks. They bolted iron railings along the paths so a man wouldn't be blown off in a gale. They built the tower itself, 75 feet of it, white, near the highest point of the island, so that its lamp stood well over 200 feet above the water. The whole thing cost a little under £1,900, which was a serious sum then. And in December of 1899, the lamp on Eilean Mòr was lit for the first time. Think about what it took just to keep it running. There was no way on or off that rock except by boat, and the boat could only come when the sea allowed it, which in winter might be once a fortnight, or not for a month. The men lived up there in a small block of rooms at the foot of the tower. They cooked their own food. They carried their own water. They kept watch on the lamp in shifts through every night, climbing the tower stairs in the dark to check the flame, to crank the machinery that turned the light, to trim and tend and make sure that flash went out over the water on time, every 30 seconds, without fail, because somewhere out there a ship was steering by it. And in the day, in any weather that let them, they went down to the landings to check the ropes, to bring up stores when the relief boat came, to keep the tramway and the railings and the tackle in order. It was hard, cold, repetitive work, and the men who did it were chosen precisely because they were steady. You did not send a nervous man to a rock like that. For 1 year it did exactly what it was built to do. It turned, it flashed, 2 white flashes every 30 seconds, and ships 20 miles out could take their bearing from it and know where the rock was in the dark. For 1 year, the loneliest light in Scotland kept every promise anyone made about it. And then it went out. Let me tell you about the men, because they weren't strangers to that rock, and they weren't fools, and they weren't new. There were 4 keepers assigned to the Flannan Isles station, though only 3 lived out there at any one time. The 4th would be ashore on rotation, resting with his family, waiting his turn to go back out. The head of them was James Duckett, the principal keeper. Duckett was 43 years old, a married man with 4 children, and he had given more than 20 years of his life to lighthouses before he ever set foot on Eilean Mòr. 2 decades of rock stations and lonely towers. If the sea had an ordinary trick to play, James Duckett had already seen it. The second was Thomas Marshall, second assistant keeper. A younger man, unmarried, steady, by every account, and good at the work. The third was Donald MacArthur. And MacArthur is the odd one in the group, in a way that matters later, so listen. MacArthur wasn't a permanent keeper at that station. He was what they called an occasional keeper, a relief man, a stand-in, brought out to fill a gap when one of the regulars couldn't serve. That December, one of the regular men, William Ross, had fallen ill, so MacArthur was sent out in his place. He was an ex-soldier, a married man himself, with 2 children back home, and the one piece of personal reputation that comes down to us about him is that he had a temper. A hothead, people said, not a man who backed away from a thing. Keep that in your pocket, too. When they were off duty, these men weren't hermits. They had homes and families. They lived with their wives and children in a line of shore houses at a place called Knockmore, in the village of Braescleat on Lewis. You could stand in Braescleat on a clear night and see the flash of your husband's light out on the horizon, 20 miles off, and know he was alive and doing his job. The 4th keeper, the one who happened to be ashore that December, was a man named Joseph Mòr. Remember Joseph Mòr. Of the 4 of them, he's the one who has to walk through the door. There's a photograph. It was taken around the 7th of December, 1900, just days before it happened, when the superintendent came out on a routine visit. You can find it if you look. 3 keepers and their superintendent, posed and serious the way people were in old photographs. Heavy coats, brass buttons, the enormous mustaches of the age. They look like exactly what they were. Sober, competent men, standing on a rock at the edge of the world with no idea that in about a week, 2 of them and their replacement would step out into the weather and simply cease. Here is the last ordinary week anyone can account for. On the 7th of December, the relief boat came, the superintendent visited, the photograph was taken, supplies were landed, and the boat went home. Everything normal. For the next few days, the men kept the light. The keeper's log, the real one, recorded what a lighthouse log always recorded. The weather, the wind at 9 in the morning, the reading of the barometer and the thermometer, the time the lamp was lit and the time it was put out. Routine. I want to be very clear about that, because you are going to hear a different version of this log everywhere, and most of it is a lie, and I'll come to the lie, because the lie is its own strange chapter. But the true record, as far as the true record goes, is just 3 careful men writing down ordinary numbers. The last entries anyone can point to are dated the 15th of December. Notes made that morning. The wind, the glass, the temperature. Nothing that says goodbye. Now, out on the shipping lanes that same night, a steamer called the Archtor was passing north through those waters, and the men on the Archtor noticed something. The light on the Flannan Isles wasn't lit. That rock they'd all learned to steer by, that turning flash, just wasn't there. Only darkness where the light should be. The Archtor couldn't do much about it out there in the dark and the weather. This is 1900, no radio to speak of. You couldn't shout across the water to shore. So the Archtor carried the news in her hold, so to speak, all the way to port at Leith, and reported it, and the report worked its way through the system to the Northern Lighthouse Board. And here is the first cruel thing about this story. By the time anyone ashore understood that the loneliest light in Scotland had gone dark, several days had already passed. And then the weather closed in, storm after storm rolling up out of the Atlantic, so that no relief boat could get anywhere near that rock. For 11 days, the light on Eilean Mòr stayed out. 11 days of ships passing an unlit island and wondering. 11 days while, ashore in Braescleat, 3 wives looked at a black horizon where the flash used to be. And this is worth sitting with for a second, because it's one of the quiet horrors of the whole thing. For most of those 11 days, nobody ashore even knew there was a crisis. The system was slow. The report from the Archtor took time to reach the right desk. The weather kept the relief boat pinned in harbor. And so the machinery of concern turned over slowly, form by form, telegram by telegram, while out on the rock the room sat empty and the clocks ran down one by one and stopped. There was no way to know, ashore, whether the men were dead or hurt, or simply unable to light the lamp for some ordinary reason, holding on out there and waiting for help that the sea wouldn't let through. For 11 days the honest answer was, nobody knew anything, and the sea, which is the only thing that did know, wasn't saying. The relief vessel was a boat called the Hesperus, under a captain named Jim Harvey. She was meant to have gone out days earlier with supplies and the change of keepers. The weather wouldn't let her. She finally got clear and reached the Flannan Isles just before noon on the 26th of December. Boxing Day, the day after Christmas. And already, before anyone landed, the men on the Hesperus felt it. There should have been a flag flying on the pole by the landing to greet the relief boat. No flag. There should have been empty provision boxes left out ready to be swapped for the fresh ones. No boxes. There should have been 3 men, or at least 1 man, standing on the rock watching the boat come in because a relief boat was the biggest event in a keeper's month. Nobody. Captain Harvey sounded the ship's whistle. Nothing answered but the gulls. He fired a flare, a rocket, the kind of thing that would bring any living man on that island straight to the cliff edge. The flare burned out over an empty rock, and nobody came. So they put Joseph Mòr into the boat and rowed him in. Think about who Joseph Mòr was for a second. This was his station. These were his colleagues. He'd stood on that rock with them. He was only ashore that week by the luck of the rotation. It could just as easily have been him out there, and one of them stepping into this boat. Mòr climbs out onto the landing, and he starts up the steps. There are about 160 of them, cut into the cliff, switching back and forth up the 200 feet to the tower. And he climbs them alone in the cold, while the men in the boat behind him get smaller, calling out as he goes, and getting no answer, but the wind coming back down the stairs at him. The first door he reaches, the gate in the wall around the station, is shut. He goes through. The main door of the lighthouse, the outer door, is shut too. He opens it. Inside, the entrance hall. He calls out. The island swallows his voice. He goes to the kitchen. And this is the part that has kept people awake for 120 years because it isn't horror in the way you'd expect. There's no wreckage, no blood on the walls, no sign of a fight. It's worse than that in a way. It's ordinary. The kitchen is tidy. The fire in the grate is dead and not just gone out, dead cold, gray ash. The kind of cold a fire only gets after days of nobody tending it. The clock on the wall has stopped. Every clock in the place has stopped, run down, because clocks in 1900 needed a hand to keep them going, and for days there had been no hand. The pots and the plates, depending on which account you go by, some of them out, some put away. A chair in some tellings, standing away from the table. In others, knocked over, and the men. The 3 men who kept that light, who lived and slept and ate in those rooms, who by every rule of that service should have been right there. Gone. Not one of them. Not a note. Not a message. Not a body. Joseph Mòr did not stay long in that kitchen. He said afterward that a feeling came over him in there that he couldn't put words around, and he went back out and back down those 160 steps faster than he'd come up them, and he told the men in the boat that there was nobody on the island. They didn't believe him at first. How could there be nobody? So a few of them went back up with him and searched. They went through every room of the lighthouse. They walked the top of the island. They checked the chapel ruin, the old walls, the cliff paths, both landings. 3 grown men do not simply evaporate off a rock 1/3 of a mile long, but they had. They searched it properly, understand? This wasn't a glance around and a shrug. They went over the whole top of the island on foot. They looked in the chapel ruin and behind the old stone walls. They walked both landings and looked at the water. They checked the outbuildings and the store. They went back through the lighthouse room by room, the bedrooms, the kitchen, the tower itself, in case a sick or injured man was lying somewhere they'd missed. And what they kept finding was the same thing over and over. Order. The beds were made or in ordinary condition. The lamp mechanism was in working order, just unlit. The tools were where tools should be. This wasn't a place people had fled from in a panic, leaving chaos behind them. It was a place people had walked out of on a normal afternoon, meaning to come back in an hour, and then never had. And now I want to stop the story for a moment, because right here is where the truth and the legend split apart, and if I don't pull them apart for you, you'll walk away believing something that never happened. You have probably heard somewhere about the terrifying entries in the Flannan Isles logbook, the ones where Thomas Marshall supposedly wrote about a storm worse than anything he'd seen in 20 years, where he wrote that James Duckett had gone strangely quiet, that Donald MacArthur, the hard ex-soldier, the man with the temper, had been crying, that all 3 of them had been praying. And then the final famous line, the one that gets whispered aloud in every version of this, storm ended, Sea calm, God is over all. Written, supposedly, on a day when the men were already gone, it is a magnificent piece of horror, and it is not real. None of those entries exist in any genuine record. The true log was routine, weather and numbers, and it stopped where it stopped. Those chilling lines come, as far as anyone can trace them, from a poem. In 1912, 12 years after the men vanished, an English poet named Wilfred Wilson Gibson published a poem called Flannan Isles. It's a good poem. It imagines the relief party climbing to the empty lighthouse, finding the door open and the meal untouched and the toppled chair and 3 strange birds that will not let themselves be caught. Gibson made a haunting thing out of a real tragedy, but he made it up. And over the following century, his invention and other people's inventions got folded back into the true story until you couldn't tell the poem from the report. And people started quoting a dead poet's imagination as if it were the last words of 3 drowned men. I'm telling you this not to spoil the fear. I'm telling you because the real story doesn't need the poem. The real story is that 3 experienced men in a sound lighthouse on a familiar rock left everything in order and walked out into a December afternoon, and the sea closed over the place where they had been and told nobody anything. You don't need a ghost to write that in a logbook. The rock wrote it plainly enough. Speaking of which, if you've made it this far into the dark with me, this is the moment I'll ask you the one thing I ask. This whole channel beneath darkness exists to dig up cases exactly like this one, real places, real names, real records that history tried to file away and forget. If that's the sort of thing you want more of, go and subscribe. And turn the bell on, so the next case finds you the way this one did. That's all. Back to the rock. Because there was evidence on that rock. The men who searched it weren't looking for ghosts. They were looking for the plain, physical truth of what the sea does, and the sea had left its signature all over the west side of the island. The east landing, where Moore had come ashore, was untouched, calm, ordinary, everything where it should be. But the west landing told a completely different story. Down at the west landing there was a wooden box, lashed into a crevice in the rock, where the men kept the mooring ropes and the landing tackle. That box sat 110 feet above the level of the sea, 110 feet up. That's higher than a 10-story building, and the box was gone, torn out of its crevice, the ropes that had been inside it strewn across the rocks below. The iron railings that ran along the path down to that landing, the ones bolted into the stone so a man could hold on in a gale, were bent flat and broken in several places. A length of iron railway, fixed in concrete, had been wrenched clean out of the ground, and a boulder, a single block of stone weighing more than a ton, had been shifted from where it had always sat and moved. By what? By water. That is the only thing out there strong enough. Let me put a number on how strange that is. 110 feet is not where waves belong. Waves belong at sea level. A big storm sea on that coast might throw spray 40, 50 feet up a cliff and feel enormous. For solid water to reach 110 feet and rip a lashed wooden box out of the rock takes something well outside a keeper's ordinary experience. And it gets worse, or stranger, the higher you look. Up on top of the cliff, at more than 200 feet above the sea, the turf, the grass, and its roots had been ripped away from the edge and torn back for 30 feet across the top of the island. 200 feet up, the sea had reached over the lip of the cliff and peeled the skin off the land. Now hold that image. A wave so big it broke over the top of a 200-foot cliff and stripped the grass off the ground behind it. The men who ran that station knew that side of the island could be dangerous in a westerly gale. They knew not to all be down there at once. That was a rule. One keeper always stayed with the light. Always. That's the whole point of 3 men. So what happened? On the 29th of December, the man who could best answer that question arrived on the rock. His name was Robert Muirhead. He was a superintendent of the Northern Lighthouse Board. And this was not a stranger sent to tick boxes. Muirhead had personally recruited all 3 of the missing men into the service. He knew James Duckett, he knew Thomas Marshall, he knew Donald MacArthur. He had, most likely, stood in that photograph with them 3 weeks before, the one taken around the 7th of December, the last picture of any of them alive. Now he had to come out and work out how they died. And Muirhead was careful. His report is a sober, physical, methodical document, and it's the closest thing to truth we have. He started with the clothing, because a lighthouse keeper going outside in that weather put on specific gear, and what a man was or wasn't wearing told you where he'd gone. 2 sets of oilskins and sea boots were missing from the lighthouse. Those belonged to Duckett and Marshall. So the principal keeper and his second assistant had dressed for foul weather and gone out. Boots on, waterproofs on, the full kit for going down to the landings in a gale. That part is almost comforting in its ordinariness. 2 men, properly dressed, going out to do a job. But then there was the 3rd man, Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper, the stand-in, the ex-soldier with the temper. His oilskins were still hanging in the lighthouse. His waterproof coat, the one Mòr said he always wore, was still there on its hook, which means Donald MacArthur went out of that lighthouse into a December storm on a 200-foot rock in the Atlantic in his shirt sleeves. No coat, no boots for it. No time, it seems, to dress. And here's what makes that detail crawl. By the rules, MacArthur was very likely the man whose turn it was to stay. The one who was supposed to remain with the light while the other two worked. And whatever happened out there, it was enough to make that man drop whatever he was doing. Not stop to grab his coat, not stop for anything, and run out into the weather after the other two. You do not do that for an ordinary job. You do that when you look out the window and see something happening to the two men you're responsible for, and there is no time, and you go. And I keep coming back to that window, because whatever MacArthur saw through it, it overrode a lifetime of training in a single instant. Every keeper knew the rule. One man stays with a light, always. It was drilled into them. It was the whole reason there were three. For a trained keeper to abandon that post, to leave the light, to go out with no coat into a 200-foot Atlantic gale, whatever was out that window was not the kind of thing you weigh up. It was the kind of thing you react to before you finished thinking. Two men in the water, maybe, or the wave itself, rising, already up the rock, already too big. We know the shape of what happened. We do not, and never will, know the picture in that man's eyes in the last few seconds he was a living person and not a name on a report. Muirhead put it together like this. On the afternoon of the 15th of December, after the morning's duties were done and logged, Ducat and Marshall went down toward the west landing, properly dressed, to secure that box of ropes and tackle before the weather got worse. It was the sort of thing they'd have done 100 times, and while they were down there, something came. Muirhead's words near enough were that an unusually large sea, a roller, a body of water far bigger than anything they were braced for, rushed up the face of the rock, rose above the men, and came down on them with a force nothing living could stand against, and swept them off into the Atlantic. And MacArthur, up in the lighthouse, looking out, saw it. Saw the two of them down there, or saw the wave coming for them, and broke every rule of the service in a single second, and ran. Out the door in his shirt sleeves, down toward the landing, into the exact place where the sea was already killing the other two. And it took him as well. One wave, or two. Some later keepers thought maybe it went in stages. That one man was caught, and a second went to help and was caught. And the third came down and was caught last. A man named Walter Aldebert, who kept that same light in the 1950s, knew those waters as well as anyone alive and believed something much like that. Two men down at the landing, one swept away, the second reaching for him, the third running down from the tower into the same water. Three men, one sea, no bodies. That is the official answer. The freak wave, the rogue sea, an accident. Muirhead signed his report on the 8th of January, 1901, and the Northern Lighthouse Board closed the file on it as a tragic accident. And it is, honestly, the most likely thing that happened. The physical evidence is real. The box torn from 110 feet up is real. The ton of rock moved is real. The turf stripped off the top of a 200-foot cliff is real. The sea out there is more than strong enough. But let me ask you something, and I want you to actually answer me in the comments, because I go back and forth on this myself. Do you think everything in this case has a rational explanation? One big wave, one bad afternoon, three men in the wrong place? Or do you think there's something in it that doesn't quite add up? Because there are a few things that don't quite lie flat, even in the official story, and honest people have argued about them for over a century. Here's the first one. The weather. The famous fake log talks about the worst storm in 20 years. That's the poem storm, not a real one. The actual weather records for those days show gales, yes, westerly gales, through the middle of December. But the truly violent weather, the worst of it, seems to have come after the 15th, after the day the men most likely died. So the wave that took them, if it was a wave, may have come on a day that wasn't even the stormiest. A rogue sea doesn't need a storm. It can rise out of relatively ordinary conditions, which is exactly what makes rogue waves so frightening. But it means the picture in your head, the three men battling a howling tempest, might be wrong. It might have been a gray, unremarkable afternoon, the kind you wouldn't look at twice, right up until the water stood up 200 feet tall. Here's the second thing. The East Landing was completely calm and untouched. If the whole island was being battered, why was one side serene and the other side torn apart? The answer is just geography, most likely. The sea was running from the west. The West Landing took the full weight of it. The east side was sheltered. But it does mean that a man standing on the east side that afternoon might have felt perfectly safe, while a mile away, on the far side of the same small rock, the other two were being erased. And the third thing, the one people can never quite let go of, is the door. And the coat. Ducat and Marshall, dressed and gone, that we can explain. But MacArthur, running out coatless into the weather, means that whatever the last living man on that rock saw, he saw it happening, and he had time to react, and he chose to run toward it rather than away. That's not a mystery of physics. That's a mystery of a human being's last decision. We know, roughly, what killed them. We will never know what that last man saw through the window in the seconds before he made the choice that killed him too. That is the hollow at the center of this whole thing. Now, because nature abhors a vacuum and people abhor a mystery, the empty space where the answer should be got filled over the years with everything you can imagine. Some said one of the men lost his mind out there. Isolation does things to people. The theory goes that a keeper snapped, turned on the others, and then, in horror at what he'd done, walked into the sea. And people who like that theory point at MacArthur, the temper, the soldier, the stand-in who didn't belong to the crew. I want to be careful here because these were real men with real wives and real children. And Donald MacArthur can't defend his name. There is no evidence, none, that any of them harmed the others. Nothing in the lighthouse suggested violence, the tidy kitchen, the ordered rooms, the two men properly dressed for outdoor work. That's not the scene a struggle leaves behind. The one of them did it theory says more about how much we hate not knowing than it says about 3 drowned keepers. But it's out there, so you should know it's out there. Others reach for the sea itself, the old way, the way the shepherds would have understood. They said a sea serpent had risen off the rock and taken the men. They said a giant seabird had carried them off. They said a ghost ship had slid up to the landing in the dark and its dead crew had walked the keepers off the island. They said the men had faked the whole thing, run off by boat to escape their debts, and started over somewhere no one would look. Except they had no boat, and 3 men with families do not vanish into thin air in 1900 Scotland and stay vanished forever. A few, later, in a more suspicious century, wondered about a passing ship of a different kind, that the men had been taken aboard something, willing or not, and carried off. But there was no wreck, no rescued sailor, no ransom, no witness, and no reason a passing vessel would want 3 lighthouse keepers. It's the kind of theory that sounds like an answer right up until you ask it a single practical question. And then there's the oldest explanation, the one that lives on the island itself. Remember the rules? Take off your hat, turn sunwise. Take nothing off the rock, because the rock wants back whatever you carry away. The people of Lewis had said for 1,000 years that Eilean Mòr was not entirely a place for the living, that it belonged in some way to something older. And the keepers who came after, the men who took over the light in the years and decades that followed, some of them said things too. They said that on certain nights, in a certain wind, you could hear voices out on the rock, voices in the gale calling 3 names: Duckett, Marshall, MacArthur. I don't tell you that as a fact. I tell you that because it's what men who lived out there believed they heard, alone on a rock, in the dark, keeping a light that had already failed once, knowing exactly whose place they were standing in. You keep a light lit long enough on a rock like that, and eventually the rock starts keeping something too. The light itself never stopped. That's the thing people forget. After Mòr and the search party found the island empty, they didn't just leave. Somebody had to keep the light. So Joseph Mòr, the man who'd walked into that kitchen, stayed out on Eilean Mòr with a few sailors from the Hesperus, and they lit the lamp again, and they kept it turning in the same rooms, sleeping under the same roof that 3 men had walked out of and never come back to. Imagine that first night. The men gone maybe 11 days. Their belongings still there, their beds still there, the photograph of them somewhere in the world only weeks old, and you, tending the flame they died tending, listening to the same wind that took them 160 steps above a black sea. New keepers were assigned. The station went back into normal service. For the next 70 years, men rotated out to that rock and kept the loneliest light in Scotland burning, 3 at a time, one always staying with the lamp. Always. You can be sure that rule was never broken casually again. In 1971, the lighthouse on Eilean Mòr was automated. The machinery took over. The lamp could run itself now and be watched from far away. And the last keepers came off the rock for good. Since then, no one lives on Eilean Mòr. The light still turns. Ships still take their bearing from it, but there's no one there. Now and then, a boat of birdwatchers or historians lands on the rock in good weather, climbs those same 160 steps, and stands where Joseph Mòr stood on Boxing Day of 1900. They say it's a strange place to be. Beautiful, in the hard way the far Hebrides are beautiful. Silent, apart from the birds and the wind and the water working the base of the cliff. And under all of it, that old feeling the shepherds knew, that you are a guest here, and you should not stay past dark, and you should be careful what you carry away. No fire in the grate, no clock kept ticking, no meal on the table, just the tower and the grass, and the old chapel ruin, and the wind coming up over a cliff where the turf once got torn away, and, on the west side, a landing where a box of ropes used to sit 110 feet above a sea that reached up and took it. For most of the last century, the 3 men had no marker, no grave, because there were no bodies to bury. Then, in 2018, the community back in Breskleet, the village where their families had lived, where their wives had watched the horizon, put up a memorial. A bronze wave sweeping over a small stone lighthouse set on a boulder of the island's own ancient rock. It was unveiled by a woman named Christina McLean, a cousin of Donald MacArthur. More than 100 years after the sea took him, his own family finally had somewhere to stand and say his name. James Duckett, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur, a principal keeper with 4 children and 20 years at the lamp. A steady young second assistant, and a stand-in with a temper who, on the last afternoon of his life, looked out a window and ran toward the thing that was going to kill him. Without stopping for his coat, the records survive. The report survives. The Northern Lighthouse Board still holds the story in its own archives, and you can go through Muirhead's careful account of the ropes and the railings and the boulder and the missing oilskins, and it will tell you, in plain official language, that this was an accident, that a great sea came up and swept 3 men away, and that their bodies were never recovered. And most of me believes that. The wave is real. The physics is real. The rock is real. But there's a part of this that no report can reach. Somewhere out there, on a gray afternoon in December of 1900, 3 men who knew that sea better than anyone alive ended up in the water together. And the last thing at least one of them did was make a choice we will never understand, in a moment we will never see. On a rock that people had been warning each other about for 1,000 years. Take nothing off the island, they used to say. The island wants back whatever you carry away. Maybe that's just an old fear talking. Or maybe, that December, the island simply decided that it wanted the men. So here's where I leave it with you. You've heard the evidence, you've heard the official answer, and I think it's probably the right one. And you've heard the parts that don't quite lie flat. I want your verdict. 1 freak wave, 3 men in the wrong place, a tragedy and nothing more, or something out on that rock that the report never managed to catch? Tell me down in the comments. Tell me what you think Donald MacArthur saw through that window. I go through them, and the good ones stay with me. And if this is your kind of dark, if you like a lonely place and an old fear and a story that respects the people it's about, remember I've got What the Mountain Keeps waiting for you. 8 hours of folk horror, no ads, no interruptions, just a voice, a landscape, and the sort of quiet that doesn't stay quiet. The link's in the description and pinned to the top of the comments. Start it tonight with the lights low and let it take its time. Stay with me for the next one. There's always another light out there somewhere that went dark, and another rock that never gave its answer. Until then, keep a light on. You never know what the dark is keeping.